It was the early hours of the morning. The sky seemed to hesitate between utter silence and the threat of an approaching storm. In the English Channel, thousands of men stared into the darkness as if they could read the future through the thick fog. No one spoke. The smell of oil, salt, and fear clung to every vessel. And on one of them, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, his eyes fixed on coffee-stained maps, soaked in tension, pondered the riskiest decision of his life. Could you pull the trigger on an operation that might doom 150,000 men because of a misread weather report? Operation Overlord was more than an invasion. It was a desperate gamble to free Europe from the grip of Nazi tyranny. But behind the flags and strategies, there were invisible traps, ones even the sharpest commanders couldn't control. The first of these, overconfidence. The Allies, high on their numerical and technological advantage, believed the Germans were unprepared, a fatal error fueled by optimistic reports and a misreading of Rommel's defenses. Cognitive bias, the kind that makes you see what you want to see rather than what's truly there, warped even the most disciplined minds. Clausewitz had warned, the friction of war can turn meticulous planning into lethal confusion. What looked like a well-mapped beach was in fact a living trap. But that wasn't the only game in motion. Behind the scenes, another operation, just as critical as the landings, was unfolding in silence. Operation Bodyguard, the Great Deception. Inflatable tanks, fake radio chatter, phantom armies crafted to convince the Nazis the attack would come at Pas-de-Calais. Sun Tzu would have applauded. He wrote, "All warfare is based on deception." And here on the Normandy chessboard, every move was a deadly bluff. Meanwhile, far from the front lines, Allied leaders were quietly unraveling. Fatigue, pressure, and fear corroded their minds like acid. Eisenhower, Montgomery, Churchill all faced the same unspoken question: how far can the human body be pushed before it breaks? Historian Antony Beevor reminds us that the greatest threats in war don't always come from bullets, but from the moral exhaustion of commanders. When the mind falters, the army hesitates, and hesitation kills. That morning, a soldier named James Thornton folded a final letter to his wife and tucked it inside his helmet. He knew that if the landing failed, his body might never be found. He wrote, "If I don't come back, tell our daughter I did this so she could play free." James wasn't the hero. He was just human, and that's what made his choice so powerful. But what neither James, nor Eisenhower, nor the thousands of soldiers standing on the edge of history knew was that the real minefield hadn't even begun. Because in war, the enemy isn't always across the battlefield. Sometimes it lurks inside your own decision. And this was only the first. The night before the invasion, the command tents weren't filled with celebration or bravado. They pulsed with silence. A silence so thick it seemed to press down on the maps, the radios, the cups of cold coffee untouched on wooden desks. Everyone waited, not for the storm to pass, but for a decision, one that would either mark the beginning of liberation or the death of thousands before sunrise. And the decision wasn't coming. In the upper echelons of Allied command, a paralyzing fog had settled in, not the kind that rolls over the fields of Normandy, but one far more dangerous: uncertainty. Clausewitz once warned that in war, the greatest threat isn't always the enemy. It's the fog, that invisible blindness that clouds even the sharpest minds when it matters most. And in early June 1944, that fog entered the war room. The tension between Field Marshal Montgomery and General Eisenhower was no secret. One, a British aristocrat with visions of grandeur and tight operational choreography. The other, a pragmatic American forced to play both politician and strategist. Their clashing egos didn't just slow down plans, it frayed them. A single glance across the map table could trigger hours of hesitation, recalculations, emotional standoffs masked as tactical debates. And while the Allies debated, time slipped away. The delay in giving final approval for Operation Overlord almost cost them the one advantage they held: surprise. German coastal commanders, though misled by Allied deception, were growing uneasy. The Luftwaffe had spotted unusual concentrations of landing craft. Shore artillery crews had been placed on partial alert. Every hour of Allied indecision gave the enemy more time to listen, to guess, to prepare. And even more dangerous was the failure of red teaming, the internal simulations meant to stress test the plan. Allied strategists had not fully anticipated the speed and aggression of German counterattack doctrine. The possibility that the Wehrmacht might mobilize their armored divisions with enough force to strike back within hours was either dismissed or underestimated. It was a costly oversight. But not all danger comes from the enemy's guns. Sometimes it comes from believing we have control. Overlord had been rehearsed, diagrammed, debated. Yet when the weather turned and the tides rebelled, that illusion shattered. Men who had built their careers on structure and precision now found themselves navigating chaos. The myth of total control died that week. Somewhere near Portsmouth, a junior officer named Charles Warren scribbled in his journal, "We wait for the order, but no one says when. Some say tonight, others say not yet. It's like standing at the edge of a cliff blindfolded, waiting for someone to push." Charles wouldn't survive Omaha Beach, but his words, raw, uncertain, echo the paralysis that gripped even the highest-ranking generals. And yet the irony remains, doing nothing can be deadlier than a bad decision. In that critical moment, the weight of delay almost tipped the balance of the entire war. Eisenhower ultimately overruled the hesitation. He made the call. "Okay, let's go," he said quietly, not with a roar of confidence, but with the gravity of a man who understood what hesitation could cost. But history is never that clean. The cost of indecision had already been paid, just not in headlines or statistics. It was paid in opportunities lost, in the tightening German grip on their defenses, and in the silence that filled every tent, every hallway, every hark, while the order hung in the air, suspended between courage and collapse. And as the invasion began, no one knew if the gamble had come too late. They say wars are won by bullets and bravery, but that's a myth, one we tell ourselves because it's easier than admitting the truth. Victory is built on crates, on fuel drums, on chocolate bars, rifle barrels, spare boots, and blood plasma packed in boxes labeled fragile. And in June 1944, on the beaches of Normandy, the entire fate of the largest amphibious invasion in history hinged not on heroism, but on the brutal, grinding, chaotic machinery of logistics. By dawn on June 6th, as waves of men surged onto sand and shrapnel tore through the sea air, a second invasion began. Less visible, no less critical. From Utah to Sword Beach, tens of thousands of tons of material needed to be unloaded under fire, and nothing, absolutely nothing, was going according to plan. The tides, misjudged by even the most seasoned naval officers, pushed landing craft off course. Entire convoys drifted hundreds of meters from their intended point. At Omaha, supply trucks capsized in waist-deep water before their wheels even touched dry land. One sergeant recalled seeing a crate of ammunition bobbing beside a drowned jeep. He wrote, "It was like trying to build a city on a swamp while people shot at you." That city was meant to feed an army, Maps had shown firm ground. Reality offered mud and death. And yet, Allied High Command had bet everything on the promise of a miracle. The Mulberry Harbors, temporary floating ports the size of small towns to be assembled in pieces and anchor off the coast of France. Ingenious, but untested. And the sea doesn't care about ingenuity. Within days, a storm, not a battle, destroyed Mulberry A, the American harbor at Omaha. Steel twisted like paper. Entire piers vanished. With it, so too went the hope of a smooth supply chain. Now, with tens of thousands of men moving inland, the Allied advance risked starving of fuel, of shells, of basic medical care. Richard Overy, the military historian, once called logistics the fourth arm of war. Not infantry, not armor, not air support, but the bloodstream. Without it, no division lives long. And Normandy, despite its legends, was no exception. In the chaos, there were quiet acts of defiance against failure. At Gold Beach, Corporal Isaac Delaney, barely 19, worked 18 hours straight unloading stretchers, then barrels of gasoline, and finally his own wounded sergeant, bleeding in the back of a half-sunken truck. No medals for lifting boxes, someone once joked, but that day, Isaac saved more lives than 100 bullets ever could. The psychological toll? Brutal. Soldiers arrived expecting resistance. They didn't expect to go hungry. Morale, so fragile in the first 48 hours, wavered with every delay. Letters stopped, rations ran low, and whispers began, quiet, sharp-edged. What if the beaches don't hold? Even Eisenhower felt the pressure. Reports piled up, jammed roads, munitions lost at sea, units forced to ration ammo because the next shipment hadn't landed. And yet, from the outside, the Allied machine seemed unstoppable. But the truth? Victory hung by a thread made of steel cables, wooden planks, and the aching backs of men unloading one crate at a time while enemy artillery zeroed in. Because in Normandy, the real question wasn't just who could take the beach, it was who could hold it and keep it supplied. And that question still echoed long after the guns fell silent. The morning fog over Omaha Beach didn't lift. It clawed at the sky. Gray, damp, suffocating. The kind of fog that made shapes indistinct, distances impossible to judge. Yet through it, the outlines of landing craft emerged like ghosts. Men packed shoulder to shoulder, silent, not from fear, though fear was everywhere, but because they knew. The moment the ramps dropped, the illusion of strategy would give way to pure, raw survival. Omaha wasn't supposed to be like this. The intelligence reports had described manageable defenses, scattered resistance, a weakened garrison. But the men of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions found something very different. Dug into the high bluffs and ridges overlooking the sand were entrenched German MG-42 nests, mortar pits and artillery pieces zeroed in with mathematic precision. The beach was a trap, a natural amphitheater of death. The geography of Omaha gave the defenders everything: elevation, concealment, overlapping fields of fire. And for the attackers, flat, open sand with nowhere to hide. Somewhere on Easy Red Sector, Private Nathan Kavanaugh, barely out of high school, crawled under a pile of dead bodies, his comrades, to avoid a burst of machine gun fire. Later, in a letter never mailed, he wrote, "It was like the earth opened up and swallowed our plan whole." And it did. Wave after wave of men stepped into a crucible. German fire cooked them down before they reached the surf line. Boats exploded. Bodies drifted like flotsam. Engineers tasked with clearing the beach obstacles were mowed down before they could lift a finger. The carefully choreographed advance became a desperate crawl. Sand turned to mud and then to blood. planners had relied on air support to weaken German fortifications, but morning haze and high-altitude bomb runs had missed their marks entirely. Most bunkers were untouched, fully manned, fully armed. The result? A frontal assault into a fully operational fortress. The British strategist Liddell Hart once emphasized the power of the indirect approach, that success lies not in attacking where the enemy expects, but where they least suspect. At Omaha, the Allies did the opposite. They hit the most fortified point of the Atlantic Wall head on and paid dearly for it. But still, inch by inch, men pushed forward. Lieutenant John Spaulding, who'd trained for months in England, rehearsing every footstep of this landing, watched his commanding officer vaporized by a mortar before reaching the first dune. John took charge, not out of ambition, but out of necessity. Crawling through barbed wire, he rallied a few men with nothing more than instinct and grit. He said years later, "We didn't fight for strategy. We fought because we were already there, and dying seemed worse than moving." Eventually, they found cracks in the wall. A ravine here, a breach in the wire there, grenades thrown blind, flamethrowers sweeping bunkers one by one. The beach was never truly taken. It was endured, survived, transformed from slaughterhouse to a foothold by nothing more than human will. From a tactical perspective, Omaha was a catastrophe narrowly turned into a strategic necessity. Nearly 2,000 American casualties in just a few hours. Yet those few hundred yards of coastline became the lifeline for pushing deeper into France. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't even planned. It was desperation weaponized into progress. Omaha proved something uncomfortable, something war rarely admits. Even the best plans fail, and sometimes victory doesn't look like triumph. It looks like crawling through mud with shrapnel in your leg, praying the man next to you isn't already dead. And when the sun finally broke through that gray curtain of smoke, it didn't shine on heroes standing tall. It shone on bodies, broken dunes, smoldering tanks, and a beach that had swallowed an army and spat out a miracle. What happens when the very first blow of your invasion lands scattered, blind, and alone? In the deep hours before dawn on June 6th, the sky over Normandy buzzed not with thunder, but with the low, relentless hum of engines. Hundreds of C-47 transport planes cut across the night, their cargo not bombs, but bodies. Paratroopers. Soldiers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. America's vanguard, trained for precision, dropped behind enemy lines to secure bridges, crossroads, and cause confusion in the German rear. But Normandy didn't care about their training. A thick fog rolled inland. Anti-aircraft fire erupted like dragon breath from German flak batteries, breaking formations and turning order into chaos. Pilots veered off course, jump lights lit too early, others never lit at all. And in a matter of minutes, over 13,000 paratroopers were hurled from the sky, most miles away from their intended drop zones. The plan had been elegant, the execution catastrophic. Entire units were shattered before they touched ground. Some troopers landed in flooded marshes, drowning beneath the weight of their own gear. Others found themselves alone in pitch-black pastures, disoriented, no idea where friendly lines were. Radios didn't work, maps were useless, and yet the mission had begun. Historian David Glantz once noted that airborne operations are like playing chess with smoke. Precision gives way to improvisation. And nowhere was that more brutal than in the fields around Sainte-Marie-Église. That night, Private Robert Mullen found himself in a ditch outside the town, alone, except for a corporal he didn't recognize. He said he was 101st, I was 82nd. We couldn't understand each other's signals, but we both had rifles. That was enough. Together, they ambushed a German convoy that had no idea the invasion had begun. Those fractured moments, isolated squads, accidental ambushes, bridges held by half a platoon became the chaos engine that destabilized the German rear. And while the plan had unraveled in the sky, the results on the ground told a more complex story. The confusion spread both ways. German commanders hesitated, unsure if these small skirmishes were decoys or the real thing. Panzer divisions held position, awaiting clarity, and that pause, just a few critical hours, prevented those tanks from reaching the beaches when the main assault began. The disruption, accidental as it was, had real strategic consequences. But at what cost? Casualties among the airborne units were staggering. Many never linked up with their commands. Some never found their way out of enemy territory. The psychological weight was immense. Men who had trained for a synchronized, overwhelming force now found themselves surviving hour by hour, often with no more than a handful of scattered comrades and the instinct to move forward. Staff Sergeant Elmer Red Graham, one of the few who managed to hold his original objective, a small bridge near Lafayette, wrote years later, "We didn't fight as a unit, we fought as shadows. And sometimes shadows are all you need." The airborne drop behind Normandy is often remembered as bold, daring, heroic. But the truth is more nuanced. It was improvisation forced by failure. A gamble where everything fell apart, yet somehow, in the cracks of that chaos, the foundation of success was laid. Not because of planning, but because of the grit of men who adapted, endured, and turned disorder into disruption. Because in the end, the question isn't whether the plan worked, it's whether, when the plan collapsed, the men still moved forward. What if the most decisive battle of the war was never fought? Before a single boot touched French soil, before a single shot was fired on the beaches, the Allies had already launched their most audacious maneuver, not with tanks, but with illusions. Operation Fortitude. To deceive an empire, you don't need force, you need belief. And in the spring of 1944, the Allies orchestrated one of the most elaborate lies in military history. The goal? Convince Hitler that the invasion would not come through Normandy, but through Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point between Britain and France. To do that, they built a ghost army, inflatable tanks, wooden landing craft, entire divisions fabricated on paper and radio chatter. At Dover, the Allies created the illusion of a massive invasion force led by General George S. Patton, the man the Germans feared most. They broadcast fake communications, staged fake reconnaissance, even placed Patton in public view to sell the illusion. And the Germans bought it. High Command in Berlin redirected its gaze and its reinforcements to Calais. Panzer divisions were held back. Coastal batteries re-aimed. Even days after the Normandy landings had begun, Hitler refused to believe it was the real invasion. He waited for a second blow, one that would never come. Sun Tzu once wrote, "To win 100 victories in 100 battles is not the acme of skill. To subdue the enemy without fighting, that is the acme of skill." Operation Fortitude was that principle, weaponized on a continental scale. But deception isn't just a strategic act, it's a psychological one. For German commanders stationed in Normandy, the realization came too late. General Erwin Rommel, despite his efforts to bolster the Atlantic Wall, was caught off guard by the timing and location of the landings. Requests to move armored reserves were delayed by Hitler himself, still clinging to the phantom threat in the north. And within the German ranks, fury ignited. Officers argued, orders were stalled. The sense of betrayal by their own intelligence was palpable. One captured Wehrmacht major reportedly muttered, "They outplayed us without a shot. How did we not see it?" That emotional collapse, The slow erosion of confidence was exactly what the Allies needed. But it was a fragile victory. If even one element of fortitude had been exposed, if a single spy had broken under pressure, or if German scouts had noticed the tanks didn't leave tracks, the entire ruse might have been unraveled. And with it, the real invasion could have been crushed before it began. Behind the illusion stood real men, real lives. One of them was Juan Pujol Garcia, codename Garbo, a Spanish double agent who fed Berlin a steady diet of fabrications. His false reports were so convincing, the Germans awarded him the Iron Cross, unaware he had helped orchestrate their defeat. Operation Fortitude wasn't just a trick. It was a slow, surgical rewiring of the enemy's mind, a campaign of shadows designed not to destroy, but to distract, to mislead, to delay just long enough for the real strike to break through. And it worked, because sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a bullet, it's a belief. It wasn't a general or a gun that nearly ended the invasion before it began. It was a storm. In the days leading up to June 6, 1944, the fate of the Western world hung not on strategy, but on clouds, pressure fronts, and wind. Across the English Channel, thousands of ships were anchored in suspense. Men trained to kill waited helplessly for a break in the weather. War had surrendered momentarily to nature. By early June, the Allied command faced a problem no rehearsal had solved. The channel, narrow, violent, and unpredictable, was churning with a gale that made any crossing suicidal. Waves slammed against transport ships. Low-hanging clouds threatened to blind the entire air campaign. And in the heart of it all, a group of meteorologists, rarely remembered, became the most critical voices in the room. Among them, Group Captain James Stagg, a quiet Scotsman with a sharp mind for Atlantic fronts. He stood before Eisenhower on June 4th with a message no general wanted to hear. The storm was coming. And if they launched on June 5th as planned, they risked sending the greatest invasion force in history straight into the sea's jaws. Delay or launch? Clausewitz once called friction the greatest enemy in war, not the clash of arms, but the resistance of reality itself. Here, friction wasn't metaphorical. It howled across decks and lifted waves high enough to drown tanks still strapped inside their landing craft. So they waited. And then a gap, a slim, unlikely window of calm predicted between June 5th and 6th. Not perfect, far from ideal, but perhaps just enough. The decision wasn't tactical, it was existential. Eisenhower paced, stared at the floor, then the skies, then the sea. His staff waited, clocks ticked, and then came three words that pushed history forward. Okay, let's go. That decision unleashed an army, but the weather didn't vanish. On the beaches, landing craft were tossed like toys. Naval support struggled to coordinate fire. Many units landed off course, delayed or disoriented by the tides. The 4th Infantry Division at Omaha Beach landed over 2,000 yards from their planned zone. Ironically, the mistake saved lives. Less resistance lay where they landed, but it was chaos disguised as fortune. And for others, the storm didn't spare. Mulberry A, the American artificial harbor, was destroyed days after D-Day by another violent front. Over 140,000 tons of supplies were lost or delayed. Trucks, ammunition, entire fuel depots simply vanished beneath the sea. And still they moved forward, because in that moment, the Allies understood something deeper than maps or doctrine. You don't conquer the elements, you endure them. War isn't just about firepower. It's about the ability to act when everything says you shouldn't. Private Alan Bishop from the 2nd Armored Division later described the crossing like this: "The sky spat on us, the sea beat us, but the boat didn't stop. None of us did." That night, the greatest army in modern history gambled not against Germany, but against the sky itself. And won. Barely. It's a strange thing how an entire war can hinge on what people think they know. On June 6, 1944, tens of thousands of Allied soldiers moved toward the beaches of France, guided not just by maps or orders, but by assumptions, by intelligence. But what happens when those assumptions are wrong? Throughout the planning of Operation Overlord, intelligence played a double-edged role, simultaneously opening doors to victory and laying traps in the minds of commanders. The Allies had mastered deception, yes. Operation Fortitude had redirected German eyes to Calais. But even in that triumph, blind spots remained. Allied reconnaissance misread several key German troop placements. Fortifications near Pointe du Hoc were believed to house heavy artillery capable of destroying landing craft. In reality, the guns had been moved inland days earlier. But the Rangers didn't know that. They scaled the cliffs under fire, searching for weapons that no longer existed, fighting, bleeding, dying for coordinates rendered useless by old information. Elsewhere, commanders believed that the German 352nd Infantry Division was stationed well behind the front. In truth, the division had been repositioned directly along Omaha Beach. No warning, no adjustment, just cold, calculated fire raining down on men who never expected it. Why? Because intelligence is never absolute. It's interpretation layered over noise. Victor Davis Hanson once wrote that the battlefield is shaped not by what is known, but by what leaders believe is true. And belief in war is a dangerous currency. The Germans made the same mistake, deceived by Allied agents like Garbo, who fed them fabricated reports about non-existent divisions. Berlin doubled down on their belief that Normandy was a feint. Even as bodies piled up on real beaches, Hitler insisted the real attack was still to come. That error bought the Allies days that built momentum, days that shifted history. Yet the price of misjudgment wasn't just strategic, it was human. Lieutenant Charles Niven of the Royal Engineers landed near Sword Beach expecting light resistance. His unit's objective: clear mines from a stretch of farmland outside Lyon-sur-Mer. They walked straight into a machine gun nest mapped as neutralized. By the end of the morning, Niven had lost 11 of his men. They didn't tell us wrong. They told us what they thought was right. That's different and worse. Even signal intercepts, so often the shining crown of Allied intelligence, came with consequences. Ultra, the top-secret code-breaking program based at Bletchley Park, had delivered vital insight into German movements. But it also created overconfidence. Commanders began to believe that if Ultra hadn't warned them, the danger wasn't real. And danger doesn't wait for confirmation. The moral burden was immense. Eisenhower himself carried the weight of every operation launched on a best guess. Every decision balanced between risk and reward, shadowed by the knowledge that even one misread map could bury a battalion. In the end, intelligence didn't guarantee success. It gave a direction, but not certainty. And the men who walked into the fire at Normandy did so not because they were told it was safe, but because someone had to walk first, even through the fog of half-truths and whispered wires. Because in war, sometimes, knowledge is just hope dressed as fact. how do you break an army without ever touching them? Before a single Allied soldier stormed the shores of Normandy, before bullets tore through bunkers and tanks rumbled across hedgerows, another war had already begun. A silent one. One not fought with rifles or artillery, but with fear, exhaustion, and doubt. Psychological warfare. By mid-1944, the Wehrmacht was no longer the unstoppable force of early victories. On the Eastern Front, it had bled for every inch. In Italy, it had been dragged into brutal attrition. But what the German High Command feared most wasn't just material losses. It was morale. Thin, fragile, cracking under the weight of unrelenting pressure. The Allies knew this, and they weaponized it. For months before D-Day, Allied bombers rained down on northern France. Not just military targets, but railways, communication hubs, fuel depots. Cities like Caen, Rouen, and Saint-Lô were turned into twisted, smoking ruins. The goal wasn't annihilation, it was suffocation. To cut the arteries feeding German resistance, to fray nerves, to wear down the men behind the guns. And it worked. German infantry units stationed near the coast reported erratic sleep patterns, jumpy behavior, a creeping sense of doom. They began to refer to the endless bombing as their Trombertreue ohne Schlacht, the drum fire without a battle. It was noise without answer, destruction without confrontation. It unhinged them slowly, like a rope fraying strand by strand. Inside their bunkers, the psychological toll grew. By the time Allied ships appeared on the horizon that June morning, many German soldiers were already near breaking. Some fought hard, others froze. Conflicting orders, some real, others forged by Allied radio disruption, only deepened the chaos. Historian Anthony Beaver observed that fear had become its own kind of weapon. The anticipation of invasion, prolonged and manipulated through deception and noise, had hollowed out German cohesion from the inside. Commanders began to question one another. Reports from the front were doubted. Accusations of betrayal echoed through the Wehrmacht ranks, not always spoken aloud, but felt in every delay and hesitation. In one case, an entire German anti-aircraft unit outside Carentan abandoned its post after misinterpreting a drumped Allied propaganda leaflet as an order to retreat. The paper simply read, "You are surrounded. Lay down your arms. No harm will come." That was all it took. And then there were the whispers, true or not, of betrayal within German High Command, Rommel's doubts, Rumsted's complaints, even the mention of General Hans Speidel's delayed responses began to spiral into paranoia. A fractured leadership cannot unify frightened soldiers. For the rank and file, it meant one thing. They were alone, and nothing in war is more lethal than that thought. Private Helmut Gruber, writing in his field journal days before D-Day, scrawled, "We hear the bombers every night. We do not know when they will stop. We do not know where they will land. But every night they take a little piece of us." Gruber's outpost was later overrun by American paratroopers. He was never found. Psychological warfare isn't clean. It doesn't leave bullet holes or craters. It leaves men standing and still defeated. It leaves an army intact in form, but shattered in will. And at Normandy, before the first Allied wave even touched the sand, much of the German resistance had already begun to collapse from within. because sometimes the most effective strike is the one they never see coming. What does it feel like to carry the weight of 156,000 lives in a single sentence? In the early hours of June 5, 1944, Dwight D. Eisenhower stood in a room dimly lit by war maps and sleepless eyes. Rain hammered the windows at Southwick House. Outside, the channel roared with uncertainty. Inside, silence thickened. Meteorologists had given him a thin sliver of calm. His generals gave him split opinions. His gut gave him nothing. And yet, history demanded a decision. Eisenhower was no battlefield legend. He wasn't forged in trenches or known for fiery speeches. He was calm, reserved, a coordinator of egos and strategies. But on that night, he held more power than any king or president alive. He could stop the largest amphibious invasion in human history or unleash it. Clausewitz's remarkable trinity, emotion, chance, and reason collided in that moment. And Eisenhower, never one for dramatics, finally said, almost to himself, "Okay, let's go." That's all. But privately, he wrote a second message, a note he folded and placed in his pocket. It read, "Our landings in the Cherbourg-Havre area have failed. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone." He was prepared to take the fall, publicly, alone. That's what command is. While soldiers rehearsed landings and supply ships were loaded to the brim with steel and hope, Eisenhower wrestled not with tactics, but with doubt. The pressure was unrelenting. Failure wouldn't just be military, it would be moral. A collapse of faith for millions watching from occupied Europe, from London bunkers, from the war-torn homes of Russia to the trenches in Italy. His burden was not glory, it was the possible death of an entire generation. On his word. Historians often admire his calm, but few highlight the toll. In private letters and diary fragments, his weariness bleeds through. He questioned everything, his right to command, his timing, his instincts. At one point he said to a staff officer, "I hope to God I'm right." But doubt didn't paralyze him. Instead, it grounded him. Even as generals beneath him jockeyed for recognition, Montgomery demanding more divisions, Patton fuming over his sidelined role, Eisenhower held the line, not with charisma, not with fear, but with quiet resolve that bound the Allied effort together. And his leadership mattered. A war machine of that size, over 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and hundreds of thousands of men, needed more than orders. It needed coherence. And Eisenhower became its gravity. One young soldier, Private Walter Yeager from the 1st Infantry Division, remembered hearing Eisenhower's voice over a crackling speaker before boarding the Higgins boat. He said, "I don't remember the words, just the tone, like he already knew what we'd face, like he'd carry it if we didn't make it." And many didn't, but the decision stood. D-Day succeeded not because it was perfect, but because when it counted, someone bore the unbearable. That's the paradox of leadership in war. It isn't just about command. It's about weight, responsibility that doesn't end at the shore or in the strategy room, but follows you home to every name etched in granite, every folded flag, every silent chair at the dinner table. Eisenhower made the call, and the world changed. Imagine this. It's the morning of June 6th, 1944. Shells are falling. Radio signals are burning through the air like electric panic. 1,000 miles of beach is exploding into war. And in a quiet alpine residence, surrounded by pine trees and servants too afraid to knock, Adolf Hitler is still asleep. No, this isn't an exaggeration. It's a symptom. A high command so obsessed with control that nothing, not even tanks ready to strike, not even generals begging for orders, could move until one man opened his eyes. While Allied forces clawed their way up the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc, and Omaha was becoming a graveyard in real time, the most powerful army in Europe was stuck in bureaucratic paralysis. German field commanders knew something had to be done. The 21st Panzer Division, positioned just south of Caen, sat within striking range of the invasion corridor. They were fueled, loaded, trained, but useless. No one moved without the Führer's direct command. And the Führer was dreaming. By the time authorization finally trickled down the chain of command, it was early afternoon. The Americans were already ashore. The British had pushed beyond their landing zones. A critical 6-hour window, maybe the most important in the war, was gone forever. This wasn't just a delay, it was a rupture. German officers argued in hushed tones behind bunkers. They didn't know whether to obey, to improvise, or to pray. Erwin Rommel, perhaps the only man in uniform who saw clearly what was coming, had warned of this months earlier. He'd walked the beaches, touched the sand, studied the tides like a commander possessed. He said the first 24 hours will be decisive. The enemy must be stopped on the beach. But Rommel wasn't even in Normandy when it happened. He was in Herrlingen, in the south of Germany, visiting his wife for her birthday. A field marshal sidelined by the very regime he served. You can feel it, can't you? That fracture, that growing distance between battlefield and command post, between soldier and ideology. What once looked like military might, now cracked with silence. In that vacuum, confusion multiplied. Some German units were ordered to hold, others told to counterattack. Armored reserves like the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, were kept in place for hours, locked in hesitation. They were young, fanatic, but leaderless. And war does not wait for politics to make up its mind. A junior German officer near Bayeux wrote a desperate entry in his field journal that night. "We are lions leashed to a post. The sea has opened. The enemy is here, and we are waiting for permission to breathe." Permission to breathe. And above all this chaos, the voice that should have led was whispering from a mountain, always too late. Hitler's obsession with micromanagement didn't just break strategy, it broke momentum. He'd stripped autonomy from his generals, men like Rundstedt and Gebern Schweppenberg, who knew the terrain, who understood armor, who could act. But instead, every battalion, every movement of tanks, every repositioning of firepower required approval from a man who trusted no one, who saw war not as a fluid tide, but as a stage for his will. Liedel Hart would later write that a general's strength lies in adaptation. And here in Normandy, the German army could no longer adapt, not because it lacked strength, but because it had lost freedom. And so, hour by hour, while Allied forces surged inland, building bridges, unloading tanks, planting flags, the German response became a tragic symphony of hesitation, miscommunication, and fear. Fear not of the enemy, but of giving the wrong order. The beaches were lost long before the last bunker fell. They were lost in corridors of silence, in phones that didn't ring, in commanders who knew the right move, but stood still staring at the horizon, waiting for permission that would never come in time. And in that stillness, the tide turned. How long can a man go without sleep before his soul starts to collapse? By the third day in Normandy, the sound of gunfire wasn't what made men flinch. It was the silence between shots. The moment when adrenaline faded and reality came back into focus. Blistered feet, crusted blood on uniforms, hunger so deep it no longer growled, just sat there, gnawing. The human body is remarkable. It endures, it adapts. But war pushes it to places biology was never meant to go. And in June of 1944, that line between human and unbreakable was crossed again and again. Not in glorious charges, but in small, brutal acts of persistence. Take Private Jules Becker, 22, from Milwaukee. On June 7th, just outside the village of Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer, his squad had been reduced to 5 men. The rest were scattered across a hedgerow, lifeless, their names already fading into the soil. Becker hadn't eaten in over 18 hours. His right hand trembled from shock, not from cold. He carried 1 grenade, 1 half-spent clip, and the weight of leading 3 younger soldiers who looked at him like he had the answers. He didn't. But he kept moving. That was enough. What Normandy demanded wasn't courage in the cinematic sense. It was the courage to stay awake when your eyes burned, to crawl forward when your ribs screamed, to keep fighting when every instinct told you to lie down and let the earth bury you quietly. Infantrymen collapsed not just from bullets, but from gravity. Helmets that once felt like protection now crushed their necks. Boots filled with water. Bandages soaked through. The air stank of gunpowder, rot, and something bitter they never learned to name. Medical stations were overwhelmed. Triage wasn't a process, it was a verdict. Men were tagged, stacked, shifted. Some screamed, some didn't. There were no guarantees, only movement. Always forward, always deeper into the unknown. And yet, amid the exhaustion, something else emerged. Acts of insane, almost irrational heroism. Corporal Roman Soto of the 90th Infantry Division dragged a wounded radio man over 60 yards of open field under sniper fire, not because he was ordered to, but because he said he'd seen me cry once, and I couldn't let him die thinking I was weak. That's what war does. It turns small gestures into epic defiance. Historians often focus on the big moves, the armored pushes, the strategic flanks, the maps covered in arrows. But victory at Normandy wasn't drawn in ink. It was carved in flesh. It happened in foxholes soaked with rain and sweat, in whispered prayers muttered under breath, in glances exchanged between brothers in arms, too tired to speak, but still not willing to quit. Beaver once wrote that it was not firepower or planning that made the Allies unstoppable. It was their refusal to stop, even when reason said they should. And the Germans noticed. They watched men who should have crumbled rise again, attack again, fight with a kind of hunger that had nothing to do with rations. It was a hunger to survive, to endure, to finish something that had taken too many already. By the end of that first week, most frontline soldiers had slept no more than 2 hours at a time. Some hadn't changed socks in days. Morale didn't rise, it clung, by sheer will. But there was one thing that didn't fade: hope. Because in every exhausted breath, in every torn letter tucked into a breast pocket, in every hoarse whisper of "keep going," there was a kind of victory that no bullet could erase. Not all heroes in Normandy wore medals. Most wore mud. What happens after the tide recedes, but the blood stays in the sand? By June 11, 1944, just 5 days after the first boots slammed into the French coast, the map of Western Europe had changed forever. But maps don't show the weight of what was left behind, not the wreckage of German strongpoints that once seemed invincible, not the rows of crosses hastily planted in fields that only weeks earlier had bloomed whispering wheat. The Allied victory in Normandy was not just military, it was existential, and it reshaped everything that followed. In the weeks after D-Day, the German Western Front began to fold inward like a dying flame. The Wehrmacht, once stretching its black iron fingers deep into Europe, now staggered in retreat. Entire divisions vanished, ground down by a machine of flesh, steel, and strategy. Eisenhower, no longer just a planner of operations, became the architect of a new phase of war, exploitation. The beaches had been taken, but now came the real gamble. Could momentum outpace resistance? And it wasn't easy. The bogage, those ancient tangled hedgerows that crisscrossed Normandy, became a nightmare maze. For tanks, it was as if the land itself resisted the invasion. Each turn, each mound of green hid the threat of ambush. American and British forces learned to adapt quickly, using bulldozers and artillery to break through the natural fortifications. The terrain, while seemingly pastoral, became the crucible in which adaptability turned into survival. Strategically, the German command structure had fractured. Hitler, now more paranoid than ever, believed Normandy was still a diversion. He held back critical armored divisions, convinced that the real invasion would come at Pas de Calais. Operation Fortitude, the deception campaign, had worked too well. And by the time the truth reached Berlin, the window had closed. What could have been a counteroffensive became a series of desperate holding actions. But war doesn't pause for strategy. It unfolds with human cost. In towns like Carentan and Saint-Lô, rebel replaced history. Civilians, caught between gunfire and starvation, moved through shattered homes like ghosts. And Allied troops, many still teenagers, carried both guilt and resolve as they pushed forward. Every liberated town was a paradox, cheers and tears, gratitude and grief. The cost of freedom was real, and it had names. Victor Davis Hanson, the American classicist and military historian, once described Normandy as the battlefield where modern warfare was redefined, not just through technology or coordination, but through a new form of coalition warfare, multiple nations, cultures, and doctrines fighting as one, under shared objectives and divergent pasts. It was an orchestra of chaos, yet it somehow held rhythm. The Second Front, so long delayed, so heavily demanded by Stalin, was now real. German forces were forced to split, and the Eastern Front, already a furnace, became a death sentence. Normandy wasn't just a victory, it was a domino, a geopolitical shockwave. Hitler's worst nightmare, a war on two fronts, now inescapable. And still, beneath the headlines and battle reports, the human ledger whispered its own truths. Private Thomas Granger, 19 from Tennessee, survived the landing, only to be killed in a field near Calmont by a sniper's bullet. His journal, later found and archived, ended with a single line, written on June 9th. "If we win, let them know I didn't run." That line, handwritten in mud-streaked pencil, now rests in the Library of Congress. It's more than a sentence. It's a heartbeat. Normandy didn't just crack the Atlantic Wall, it cracked open the future. It revealed both the brilliance and fragility of command, the brutality of attrition, and the power of unity. It exposed the bones of Hitler's empire and marked the moment the Allies stopped reacting and started conquering. From that point on, Every step towards Berlin was no longer hypothetical. It was happening, slowly, brutally, but undeniably. And so, the beaches of Normandy were not the end of a battle. They were the end of illusion. From that soil, waterlogged with sacrifice, rose the second wind of the free world. In Normandy, the battlefield became more than terrain. It became a mirror, and what it reflected back to the world was brutal, unfiltered truth. That the war wasn't simply a contest of steel and fire. It was a confrontation between mindsets. The German High Command, chained to rigidity, believed that control could tame war, that plans drawn with a ruler and ink could predict the shifting rhythm of chaos. But Normandy shattered that illusion. Their fatal error wasn't just tactical, it was conceptual. They underestimated what chaos becomes when embraced as a weapon. While they obsessed over theoretical breakthroughs, the Allies moved with pulse and instinct, messy, imperfect, but alive. Yet amid that chaos, something even more powerful emerged: moral fortitude. Across hedgerows and cratered villages, men didn't fight simply because they were ordered to. They fought because they believed the world had to be different on the other side of this storm. Exhausted, wounded, undersupplied, they pressed forward not for glory, but because their courage became contagious. And in war, that matters. In fact, it multiplies. It lifts a battalion. It redefines resolve. It turns a broken line into a rising tide. And behind that tide was another force, quieter, often unseen, but decisive: adaptive command. While German generals waited for orders that no longer matched reality, Allied officers adapted on instinct. Decisions were made in mud-soaked fields, not just briefing rooms. Young lieutenants took initiative. Generals rerouted armor mid-assault. Intelligence from scouts, locals, and captured radios was acted on within hours, not days. This wasn't perfect command, but it was living command, and that made all the difference. Because Normandy didn't reward the strongest, it rewarded the most awake. So when the maps were redrawn and the lines of battle moved eastward, the lesson wasn't etched in stone. It was carved into the flesh of those who had endured it. War is not controlled, it is confronted. And only those who dare to adapt, who hold firm to their purpose even when the ground shifts beneath them, can turn a battlefield into a turning point. In the mud and ruin of France, that truth was written not with speeches, but with steps, one foot in front of the other, still breathing, still moving, and never waiting for permission.